They preached strength, purity, and domination, while secretly limping, shaking, bleeding, and breaking down. Behind the uniforms and speeches, the architects of the Third Reich were walking contradictions, diseased minds in failing bodies, drugged-up ideologues masking tremors with ideology. This isn't a history of power, it's a story of decay, hidden illnesses, quiet humiliations, the strange, unsettling truth about what was rotting behind the curtain. These were the Nazis you never saw, and the bodies that betrayed them. This is 17 Nazis with strangest diseases you never knew. And it starts, as it always does, with a trembling hand in a bunker. Before we dive in, if twisted history and untold contradictions are your kind of late-night fuel, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a descent like this one. Also, quick check-in. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far and how late this rabbit hole really goes. 1. Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, the man whose name has become shorthand for evil, also spent the final years of his life in a private war with his own nervous system. By 1945, he could barely hold a teacup without spilling it. His left hand trembled uncontrollably. His gait had slowed to a stiff, robotic shuffle. His voice, once a theatrical weapon of mass persuasion, was increasingly muted and slurred behind closed doors. While the Third Reich crumbled around him, its leader was shrinking, literally, into a trembling, chemically modified husk. The condition? Parkinsonism. Whether it was Parkinson's disease or post-encephalitic Parkinsonism is still a clinical debate. But the symptoms were plain as day in the last footage of him inspecting child soldiers and pretending to have a plan. Tremors, bradykinesia, masked facial expression. It was as if history itself had started embalming him early. Layered on top of this neurological decline was his infamous dependence on Dr. Theodor Morell, a personal physician with the bedside manner of a used car salesman and a briefcase full of amphetamines, barbiturates, and hormone injections sourced from dubious animals. Hitler's daily drug regimen was less a treatment plan than a pharmaceutical roulette wheel. It may have sharpened his focus briefly, long enough to scream through a few more meetings, but it left his brain chemically warped, his body jittery, and his judgment increasingly erratic. And yet, nobody said a word. Not in public. His inner circle whispered, medical staff kept notes, and the propaganda machine showed only still photos. The Führer was not allowed to look weak, but his silence spoke volumes. A man paralyzed by the fear of appearing paralyzed. Strange, isn't it? The man who demanded absolute control of an empire couldn't control his own hands. But his propaganda chief? Now that's another story. Because Joseph Goebbels didn't shake. He limped. 2. Joseph Goebbels. Joseph Goebbels, master of manipulation and Reich minister propaganda, walked with a noticeable limp, a small, dragging reminder that even architects of ideological purity are shaped by imperfection. His right foot was twisted and withered, the long-term result of childhood poliomyelitis. In a regime obsessed with physical perfection, Goebbels was a walking contradiction, not that he let it stop him. If anything, he leaned into the narrative. The deformity, often misdescribed in popular accounts as a clubfoot, became part of his origin myth. He was the clever underdog, the intellectual warrior, the man who overcame weakness through willpower. A classic fascist trope. The wounded becomes the vengeful. In Goebbels' case, the foot didn't just shape his walk, it reshaped his ego. Behind the scenes, he was intensely self-conscious about it. He tailored his suits to minimize the appearance of the leg-length discrepancy. He avoided public images that showed him walking. And yet, in his diaries, you'll find a strange blend of vulnerability and vanity. The limp was a source of bitterness, a reason to distrust the world that once pitied him. And when the time came to help build a world that punished weakness, he knew exactly how. In truth, the deformity didn't limit his performance as a propagandist. It may have even sharpened it. Goebbels compensated with rhetorical viciousness, pouring poison into microphones and headlines. His hatred didn't limp, it ran wild. He could walk into a room and dismantle a man's reputation in 5 sentences. Perhaps he learned early that words could do what his legs could not. Still, the contradiction lingered. The crippled man preaching eugenics, the broken body insisting on racial hygiene. And if you think that's ironic, wait until you meet the man who flew too high, then crashed right into morphine addiction. And if you're still here, somewhere between a dictator's trembling hands and a propagandist's crooked walk, you're clearly built for the long haul. So go ahead and subscribe for more deep dives into the strange, the hidden, and the historically uncomfortable. Also curious, where are you listening from and what time is it right now? Let's see just how global and sleep-deprived this audience really is. 3. Hermann Goring. Hermann Goring entered history a war hero and left it in a fog of opioid withdrawals and ridicule. A man once admired for his daring aerial feats in World War I had by the 1940s become a bloated caricature of himself, sweating in custom uniforms that barely contained his expanding frame, popping paracodeine like breath mints, and issuing orders through a fog of pharmacology and delusion. His addiction didn't start in a back alley. It started in a hospital. After sustaining injuries during the beer hall putsch in 1923, Goring was treated with morphine. He liked it, a lot. And the world never quite got him back after that. The pain faded, but the habit didn't. Over time, it metastasized into dependence. By the time he was running the Luftwaffe, his judgment was erratic, his moods unstable, and his waistline expanding in sync with his supply of drugs and desserts. Fellow Nazis mocked him behind his back. Even Hitler lost patience with his drug-fueled arrogance. But Goring kept his status through sheer bombast and bureaucratic inertia. He saw himself as untouchable, an emperor in a silk robe, a collector of stolen art, puffing on fine cigars, commanding air raids with one hand while holding a syringe in the other. When the Allies finally captured him, they had to detox him. Cold turkey. The mighty Reichsmarshal was reduced to trembling in a cell, sweating out years of excess under the watchful eye of military doctors. He lost weight. He regained some clarity. And at Nuremberg, he performed better than most of his co-defendants, if only temporarily. But even then, the question hung in the air. How many decisions had been made under the influence? How many deaths ordered between doses? And yet, for all his volatility, Goring still lived in a shared reality. The same can't be said for the next man, who flew solo into the realm of delusion and never quite made it back. 4. Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess spent most of his life running from invisible poisons. The man once second in command to Hitler eventually fled Germany not from Allied bombs or rival factions, but from voices in his own head. In 1941, he boarded a Messerschmitt and flew solo to Scotland in what remains one of the most bizarre and unexplained diplomatic stunts of the war. He claimed he came in peace. British officials assumed he'd lost his mind. Both may have been right. Long before his solo flight, Hess showed signs of mental instability. He suffered from persistent hypochondria, convinced he was being poisoned, monitored, or manipulated by mysterious forces. In custody, he often refused food unless it came from specific sources. He reported losing his memory, selectively and suspiciously, during the Nuremberg trials, and made doctors chase shadows through pages of imagined symptoms. Was it all a performance? Possibly. But even the psychiatrists couldn't agree. Some saw psychosis. Others saw a man weaponizing madness to avoid accountability. His condition defies easy classification. Post-war psychiatric analyses describe a paranoid delusional syndrome with hints of amnesia and obsessive somatic complaints. It wasn't full-blown schizophrenia. It wasn't malingering. It was something in between, a man halfway between fantasy and strategy, refusing to pick a side. And still, he was loyal. To Hitler, to the Reich, to the bitter end. In his warped perception, the solo flight was an act of peace, a mission of diplomacy. What it really did was remove him from power and into a lifelong spiral of isolation and suspicion. First in a British cell, then in Spandau, where he would spend decades with only his delusions for company. He feared poison. Ironically, his mind provided a steady drip. But the next Nazi had a different kind of chronic torment, one you could trace, quite literally, to his stomach. 5. Heinrich Himmler. Heinrich Himmler was a man of quiet routines and catastrophic decisions. A bureaucrat of genocide, obsessed with order, herbal remedies, and his own fragile digestion. While orchestrating one of the most ruthless killing machines in history, Himmler simultaneously fretted over his stomach, reportedly plagued for years by chronic discomfort, indigestion, and vaguely described complaints. Was it ulcers? Stress? A psychosomatic echo of the horror he enabled? Biographers suggest a functional gastrointestinal disorder, possibly aggravated by his rigid personality, health obsessions, and near-religious commitment to self-regulation. This is the man who thought garlic was a medical necessity, who bathed ritualistically, and who avoided meat for moral reasons, while issuing extermination orders by the folder. Heinrich Himmler, history's most unlikely hypochondriac, created a world of industrial-scale brutality while insulating himself in a cocoon of wellness, routines, and stomach powders. The contradictions are staggering. A man who couldn't handle spicy food ran death camps. A man who feared microbes engineered typhus experiments on prisoners. A man who studied homeopathy oversaw poison gas logistics. To be clear, his stomach aches didn't impair his administrative function. If anything, they reinforced it. His health anxieties led to stricter routines, tighter controls, a micromanager's grip on the machinery of death. His body might have been sensitive, but his policies were anything but. In the end, Himmler's fatal act was not one of command, but of cowardice, though we won't delve into the details here. Suffice it to say, the man who treated discomfort like a crisis met a reckoning far larger than his digestion. Still, his physical weakness remains an irony too rich to ignore. And then there's Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's protege, famously cold-blooded, seemingly indestructible, until something very warm and very sharp made him mortal again. 6. Reinhard Heydrich. Reinhard Heydrich was called the man with the iron heart. A man of unflinching efficiency, terrifying calm, and administrative cruelty so refined it felt surgical. Even among the Nazi elite, he stood out for his sheer absence of hesitation. Then one day in Prague, his car slowed at the wrong corner, and for once, someone else made a decision. In May 1942, Czech resistance fighters ambushed his vehicle with a grenade. He survived the blast at first. He even stood up. But inside his abdomen, something had ruptured. A splinter of metal had introduced infection. Over the following days, septicemia set in. Doctors operated. Too late. Heydrich died not from trauma, but from infection. The body of steel, undone by bacteria. The irony didn't escape anyone. Here was a man responsible for mechanizing mass murder, taken out by a hand grenade and a dirty wound. It wasn't even a perfect attack. The grenade had missed its direct mark, and yet it killed him anyway. It killed. Medically speaking, his death was both preventable and inevitable. Antibiotics were limited. Surgical standards of the time were no match for deep-seated infection. But symbolically, the fall of Heydrich was a seismic event. It triggered brutal reprisals in Czechoslovakia. Entire villages were erased from the map. The Nazi leadership, rattled by the vulnerability of their so-called elite, responded with fury and fear. Heydrich's death left a vacuum. Cold precision was replaced with bureaucratic chaos. Even Himmler couldn't replicate his former protege's lethal efficiency. The Iron Heart had stopped, but the machinery he helped build kept running. And speaking of machinery held together by sheer force of delusion, next comes Robert Ley, a man who climbed through Nazi ranks with the charm of a drunk uncle and the brain wiring of a broken radio. 7. Robert Ley. Robert Ley was a man who seemed permanently on the verge of falling over. Not just from drink, though that certainly didn't help, but from the neurological aftershocks of a traumatic brain injury that may have reshaped the entire arc of his life. Before he was head of the German Labor Front, before he became a grotesque mouthpiece for Nazi labor policy, Ley had been a young pilot in World War I. His plane crashed. He suffered a serious head injury. After that, something shifted, and never quite shifted back. He slurred his speech. He stammered. His sentences often lost their way mid-air, as if his brain had trouble keeping pace with his ambition. His behavior, even by Nazi standards, was erratic. He was bombastic, impulsive, prone to outbursts and wild exaggerations. Fellow officials found him embarrassing. He was kept around because of his loyalty, not his logic. Theories developed, later reinforced by psychiatric evaluations. Maybe that old head injury had done more than leave a dent. Ley also drank. A lot. Alcohol may have been a form of self-medication, or just fuel on a neurological fire. Either way, the result was a volatile cocktail of disinhibition and delusion. In public, he barked slogans. In private, he could barely form coherent thoughts. The man responsible for managing the Nazi labor apparatus was, much of the time, a barely functioning figurehead. When the war ended, he was captured. In custody, doctors found evidence of long-term neurological impairment, possibly consistent with traumatic brain injury. But by then, the damage, to himself and to millions of others, was already complete. And then there was Julius Streicher. Unlike Ley, his brain was mostly intact. But his body? That was another story. One bad fall, one bad leg, and a lifetime spent limping after his own hatred. 8. Julius Streicher. Julius Streicher limped through history like a punchline from a bad dream. A man so consumed by hatred, he made it his entire career. And yet, beneath the bluster and bile, he carried a quiet physical reminder of his own fragility. His left leg had been partially paralyzed in a skiing accident years earlier. The injury left him with a noticeable limp, a subtle but permanent drag in his step. A minor detail, perhaps, but not in a regime obsessed with strength, symmetry, and bodily perfection. Unlike Goebbels, whose own leg deformity became part of his propaganda narrative, Streicher didn't mythologize his injury. He barely acknowledged it. And perhaps that's because it didn't fit. He wasn't a wounded intellectual or a tragic overachiever. He was something cruder, a rabble-rousing newspaper man who turned racist bile into tabloid spectacle. As the publisher of Der Stürmer, Streicher specialized in vitriol. His propaganda was so grotesque, even other Nazis flinched. The leg? It didn't stop him from shouting. It didn't stop him from pointing fingers. But it did make him less than ideal for photo ops. He moved awkwardly. He lacked the polish of the party elite. By the time he was captured after the war, he was already sidelined, both politically and physically. And yet, the detail remains in his medical records. Partial paralysis of the left leg, likely neurological in origin. An old skiing injury that never fully healed. A crooked gait beneath the cartoonish rage. You wonder sometimes how much of that rage was redirected. Blame for a body that betrayed him turned outward. But whatever his motivations, the irony lingered. A physically impaired man, preaching purity. Then there was Wilhelm Keitel, a man whose uniform was always pressed, whose papers were always signed, and whose heart, quite literally, couldn't keep up. 9. Wilhelm Keitel. Wilhelm Keitel was a man who looked the part. Tall, neat, always crisp in his Wehrmacht uniform. He signed documents with the steady hand of a bureaucrat, oversaw military briefings with the quiet demeanor of a company man. He gave the impression of order, until you started looking at the medical files. Years before the war reached its peak, Keitel suffered a heart attack and a double bout of pneumonia in 1932. The incidents marked the beginning of a long stretch of chronic ailments. Hypertension, varicose veins, intestinal issues. Later, during the Nuremberg trials, additional complications were documented: dysentery, circulatory instability, general fatigue. For a man who signed orders for mass executions and scorched earth policies, he spent a surprising amount of time being physically unwell, and yet, he kept working, or rather, he kept obeying. Keitel was known as Hitler's yes man, a military leader in title only, whose actual function was to rubber stamp criminal orders without protest. His illnesses may have slowed him down physically, but they never interfered with his loyalty, or his ability to look the other way. It's not that he was incapacitated. He wasn't. But his body mirrored the state of the institution he represented, deteriorating under pressure, increasingly fragile, propped up by routines that no longer made sense. He didn't resist the regime. He barely resisted his own ailments. By the end of the war, Keitel looked exhausted, not just morally, but biologically. The body had followed the mind into submission. But while Keitel crumbled slowly, the next man on the list collapsed fast. Ernst Kaltenbrunner didn't have the luxury of gradual decline. His body betrayed him right on the courtroom stage. 10. Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was supposed to be the replacement. When Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated, Kaltenbrunner stepped in to lead the Reich Security Main Office, the RSHA, the heart of Nazi intelligence, secret police, and coordinated terror. He had the credentials, the brutal resume, and the cold stare. What he didn't have, apparently, was the vascular stability to make it through a war crimes trial without collapsing. At the Nuremberg trials, Kaltenbrunner suffered not just moral exposure but physical failure. Early in the proceedings, he was temporarily removed from court due to a subarachnoid hemorrhage, bleeding in the space around his brain. In less medical terms, a neurological breakdown, sudden and sharp. He also suffered from gallstones, a chronic but painfully tangible reminder that his body, like the regime he had served, was full of pressure and sharp edges just waiting to rupture. The hemorrhage was significant enough to raise procedural concerns. Was he fit to stand trial? Should the proceedings be delayed? He returned to court eventually, but not without speculation. Some thought the episode was exaggerated, an attempt to evade justice or garner sympathy. Others saw it as the inevitable crash of a man long running on borrowed adrenaline and institutional power. Outside of court, Kaltenbrunner had always projected strength. Towering, scar-faced, imposing. But in captivity, his body told a different story. Infirm, inflamed, and intermittently absent. His absence wasn't just symbolic. It interrupted the very mechanism of reckoning. He couldn't answer for crimes while incapacitated, which created moments where his silence was both medical and moral. In the end, he came back to the courtroom. He answered the charges, but not before his body made its own argument, that even architects of terror can bleed like anyone else. And speaking of decline, next comes a man who never made it to trial at all, because Gustav Krupp's mind left the building long before the court could get to him. 11. Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach. Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach was the patriarch of a war machine. As head of the Krupp industrial dynasty, he supplied the Nazi regime with armaments, steel, and the logistical sinews of mechanized war. But by the time the Allies were ready to hold him accountable, Krupp himself was largely gone. Still alive, yes, but locked in the slow dissolution of arteriosclerosis, cerebral thrombosis, and what the trial documents politely referred to as senility. In plain terms, his mind was no longer present. He had suffered a significant stroke prior to the end of the war. By the time prosecutors at Nuremberg named him as one of the indicted, his condition had deteriorated to the point where he was considered unfit for trial. His hands trembled. His memory was fragmented. He was incontinent. Sometimes he didn't know where he was. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. one of the wealthiest men in Nazi Germany, a titan of industry who profited directly from forced labor and rearmament, escaped courtroom judgment not through legal acumen, but through biological collapse. His name remained on the list of defendants for a time, until reality forced a redaction. The body couldn't be put on trial if the mind had already quit. For some, this was a frustrating dodge. For others, a reminder that time itself can act as a kind of prosecutor, slow, patient, and indifferent to wealth. His legacy lived on through his son Alfred, who would later face his own tribunal. But Gustav? He faded into quiet, unceremonious decline, tucked away from cameras and court transcripts. And then there's Walther Funk. Unlike Krupp, Funk did stand trial, but his body would stage its own protest later, one slow insulin drop at a time. 12. Walther Funk. Walther Funk looked like the kind of man you'd forget was in the room until someone handed him the keys to the Reichsbank. A former journalist turned economic minister, Funk wasn't known for grand speeches or charismatic cruelty. His villainy was subtler: quiet signatures on asset seizures, steady oversight of looted wealth, the financial choreography behind atrocity. And behind it all, his pancreas was quietly malfunctioning. Funk suffered from diabetes, a disease that complicated his post-war imprisonment and eventually shaped his legal fate. During the Nuremberg trials, his condition was managed, but not without difficulty. The demands of the trial, the stress, the restricted diet, none of it played nicely with glucose regulation. Over time, the effects accumulated: fatigue, weight loss, and circulatory issues. Years later, while imprisoned at Spandau, his condition worsened to the point of requiring early release on humanitarian grounds. Diabetes didn't absolve him. It didn't cause his crimes, but it complicated his punishment. Funk, the man who once rubber-stamped the looting of Jewish property, was now a frail prisoner needing special medical care. There's no justice in that, only irony. The machinery of the Reich had long stopped, but his body kept making quiet withdrawals. His release sparked controversy. Some saw it as compassion. Others saw it as one more instance of selective leniency for white-collar perpetrators. Funk didn't return to public life. He didn't become a symbol. He simply faded, diabetic complications taking what the court could not. But if Funk's story ends in insulin and obscurity, the next figure lived longer, shouted louder, and watched his own body betray him one artery at a time. Baldur von Schirach had built his life shaping youth and spent his twilight years falling apart from the inside. 13. Baldur von Schirach. Baldur von Schirach was the regime's designated Pied Piper, the one who lured the children in. As head of the Hitler Youth and later Gauleiter of Vienna, he devoted his career to shaping the next generation of loyal Nazis. His speeches were full of destiny, sacrifice, and national purity. His legacy, less so. And in the end, the man who once marched in perfect health before stadiums of chanting boys began to fall apart piece by piece, not from bullets or bombs, but from within. At his trial and throughout his decades of imprisonment, Schirach suffered a series of medical issues that read like a slow unraveling. It began with ear problems, specifically an inflamed eardrum noted during the Nuremberg proceedings. At the time, it was a minor nuisance. But as the years passed, his ailments worsened. A serious femoral artery clot, retinal surgery, chronic thrombosis, circulatory instability. The body that once stood for the idealized Aryan future was now quietly degenerating in a prison hospital wing. Schirach lived longer than most of his peers. That gave him more time to reflect, or reframe. He claimed eventually to have seen the error of his ways. A moral awakening or strategic remorse? Historians still debate it. But the body didn't debate anything. It just continued to break down. What's unsettling isn't just that he got to live a full post-war life. It's that he lived it while slowly watching his own internal systems betray him, like a mirror image of the system he once helped design. A youth leader brought low by age, decay, and the unavoidable math of vascular disease. Still, his health issues didn't spare him public judgment, nor did they erase the path he helped carve. And just ahead on that same path, a fellow Nazi statesman who also lived long enough for his heart to make its own objections. Konstantin von Neurath. 14. Konstantin von Neurath. Konstantin von Neurath had the look of an elder statesman, the diplomat's posture, the silver hair, the air of calm authority. As Hitler's foreign minister in the early days and later as Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, Neurath represented the polished, soft-spoken face of the regime. But by the time history came to collect, that veneer was worn thin. And beneath it, a faltering cardiovascular system that dictated the terms of his punishment. In Spandau prison, where he was held after the Nuremberg verdict, Neurath suffered a heart attack. The episode was severe enough to trigger a wave of debate among Allied authorities. Was he healthy enough to remain in custody? Could he survive continued imprisonment? Eventually, the answer was no. He was released in 1954 on grounds of poor health, after serving just over half of his sentence. At the time, some newspapers framed it as a mercy. Others weren't so generous. For many, his early release felt like a loophole. One more example of a high-ranking official slipping through the net, this time not with lawyers but with arteries. Unlike more visible figures in the regime, Neurath wasn't a firebrand or a face on propaganda posters. His crimes were quieter: diplomatic cover, bureaucratic assent, and passive complicity in occupations and repression. But complicity doesn't fade with age, and while his health may have spared him the full term of incarceration, it didn't rewrite the past. In the final years of his life, he lived out a relatively private decline. No grand statements, no late confessions, just another name in the long list of men whose hearts gave out long after their responsibilities had. But not all post-war fugitives died in quiet corners. Josef Mengele's death would come suddenly, and ironically, while trying to live a life as normal as possible. 15. Josef Mengele. Josef Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death, spent over 3 decades evading capture after World War II. He escaped justice, extradition, and the international manhunts that trailed him like a fading echo. But what he couldn't escape was biology. For all the elaborate false identities, the exiled life in South America, the secrecy, his end came not in a courtroom, but in the shallow surf of a beach in Brazil, courtesy of a fatal stroke. By 1979, Mengele had become something of a ghost, occasionally cited, rarely confirmed. He lived under assumed names, stayed with sympathetic contacts, and avoided photographs. He worked odd jobs, wrote letters, complained about money. And all the while, his body aged like anyone else's. Arteries hardened, risks increased, and then, while swimming off the coast near Sao Paulo, he collapsed. Autopsy reports later confirmed a stroke. It's an unceremonious death for a man who styled himself as a scientific overseer of life and death. While his crimes were never officially tried, they were widely known. Survivors remembered his face, his selections, his presence in the camps. And in the end, it wasn't a Mossad operation or Interpol that brought him down. It was a cerebral vessel bursting in the wrong moment, at the wrong tide. His death triggered disbelief. For a while, no one was sure it was really him. Only years later, after forensic evidence and DNA confirmation, did the truth settle. Mengele had escaped human justice, but not human biology. There's no poetry in it, just irony. A man who manipulated the bodies of others brought down by the uncooperative mechanics of his own. And the next figure? He didn't die on the run. He stayed to the end, took a bomb to the face, and somehow walked away. Alfred Jodl knew what it meant to survive an explosion, at least for a little while. 16. Alfred Jodl. Alfred Jodl was the type of general who looked more comfortable in a conference room than on a battlefield. As chief of the operations staff of the German High Command, OKW, he was one of the principal architects of Germany's military campaigns and one of the regime's most obedient strategic minds. He was present for some of the war's most pivotal decisions, signing orders that set entire countries on fire, often with an air of passive detachment. But even a man of papers and planning couldn't stay shielded forever. On July 20th, 1944, that detachment was shattered, literally, when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg's briefcase bomb exploded during a meeting in the Wolf's Lair. Jodl was among those injured. While Hitler escaped with only minor wounds, Jodl suffered a concussion from the blast. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was a literal and symbolic rupture. The war, once mapped out in clean lines and arrows, had finally broken through the walls. The concussion did not incapacitate him for long. He returned to his duties, resumed operations, and continued working through the increasingly desperate final months of the war. There's no definitive record of lasting cognitive effects, but some biographers have speculated that the injury may have compounded his fatigue, especially as Germany's military position collapsed. At Nuremberg, Jodl maintained the stoic, procedural tone of a career officer. He insisted he had only been following orders, a defense that failed to impress the tribunal. He was sentenced to death, and unlike others, offered little resistance. Still, it's hard not to picture that moment. The strategist caught in an unexpected blast, his world briefly flipped sideways, his head ringing. A quiet concussion in the middle of a loud conspiracy. And speaking of explosions that don't kill but change everything, the final figure on this list knew exactly what it meant to be hit, to survive, and to walk away missing a piece. 17. Hans Baur. Hans Baur was Hitler's personal pilot, a man who flew closer to the inner circle than most, and by the end, paid the price in blood and bone. More than just a chauffeur of the skies, Baur was a trusted aide, a background figure in photographs, always within earshot of history but rarely its focus. That changed in April 1945, when Berlin was crumbling, the bunker walls were closing in, and escape plans were hastily scribbled on the backs of maps. In the chaos of the Reich's final hours, Baur attempted to flee the city alongside remnants of the inner circle. The breakout failed. During the attempt, Baur was shot in the legs, wounds that were severe enough to require emergency surgery under Soviet custody. His right lower leg was amputated, marking the end not only of his military usefulness, but of the quiet anonymity he'd maintained throughout most of the regime. Unlike others, Baur lived on. He spent 10 years in Soviet captivity, enduring harsh conditions and interrogations. Upon release, he returned to West Germany, published memoirs, and lived until 1993, long enough to outlast nearly every name on this list. But his injury remained. The missing leg was more than just a wound. It was a permanent reminder of proximity to collapse, of a man who flew too close not to the sun, but to the storm of history. There's something grimly poetic about it. The man who flew Hitler across Europe, who watched plans take off and land in time with speeches and invasions, ended his days limping through obscurity, grounded, literally and figuratively. 17 men. 17 bodies that failed in 17 ways. Some quickly, some slowly, but all inevitably. Strange how even the architects of supposed perfection were, in the end, undone by their own biology.